His name was Nestor-Iskander, a strange hyphenated name, both Christian and Muslim at the same time. He has written an outstanding piece of literary work, The Tale on the Taking of Constantinople by the Turks. A witness and a participant of dramatic events of 1453, when the young Ottoman Empire gained control over Constantinople, the city we currently know as Istanbul. His book is a detailed account of the siege and the fall of the city. We do not know much about Nestor-Iskander, but we shall try to find out more about his life, as it can provide us with the answer to countless important questions of present interest for both Europe and the whole world. Parateichion. Istanbul, Turkey, present day. Istanbul, one of the biggest cities in Europe and in the world. A real crossroads where many worlds meet. The city that enchants everybody who has visited it at least once. Parateichion. The outer perimeter of the ancient city walls were built 16 centuries ago. In April and May 1453, one of the biggest battles in history was fought there. The city defenders were no more than 7,000 soldiers, but they faced an Ottoman army of at least 100,000 men. Constantinople, the evening of the 27th of May, 1453. In the evening before the last attack, Isidore of Kiev was getting ready to deliver a liturgy in St. Sophia Cathedral. He was the Metropolite of Kiev and all Rus. By that time, he was the top clerical hierarch in Constantinople. Isidore, the Metropolite of Kiev and all Rus. Isidore knew well what was going to happen that night, the last and decisive city assault. Some Christians from the army of Sultan Mehmed had warned the besieged city about it. Many of those attending that liturgy were going to die in the battle, but they still hoped to win. In fact, they had been defeating all of the attacks before that, despite being badly outnumbered. About half of the city defenders were foreigners, mainly volunteers. Christian rulers of the West and even from the Orthodox East had never sent any help to the city. The tale of the taking of Constantinople by the Turks describes the siege and the assaults, but it also gives us some ideas about its author. Kiev, 1436. Nestor was a young monk in the Kiev-Pechesk monastery. This Kievite was a faithful man, a skillful writer, and erudite. He was knowledgeable about scriptures and history. At the same time, he had some military experience and understanding of European policy of that period. We shall try to find out how this last outstanding writer of Kyivan Rus came to Constantinople, how he got his strange name, and why his tale still remains significant today. (1436) Grand Duchy of Lithuania, Rus and Uniate. Back then, Kyivan Rus was part of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. This huge territory is war-struck. Two dukes, Sigismund and Svetogайло, conducted a civil war against each other. Sour-tempered, Svetogайло orders the execution for the Kiev metropolite Gerasim, who is burned alive in Vitebsk. Vitebsk, 1436. The Metropolite of Kiev and all Rus, Gerasim.
Благословляю Тебе, Господи, що удостоїв мене в цей день і час стати причасним до числа мучеників Твоїх і для воскресіння вічного життя душі і тіла у нетлінні Духа Святого. І да буду я прийнятий з числа їх сьогодні перед лицем Твоїм.
За таємне зносини з ворогом нашим, князем Сигизмундом Істосовичем, вирікається князем нашим, Светогайлом Ольгердовичем, митрополитові Герасиму, смерть через палення на вогні. Підпалюй!
Моліться за мене грішного, люди добрі, і за князя свого моліться, щоб простилося йому суд неправедний. Господи, Господи, прийми мою душу грішну, я вже йду до Тебе, і да святиться ім'я Твоє, да прийде царствіє Твоє, як на землі, так і на небі. Амінь.
And that is the mess from where the new Kiev Metropolite Isidore comes. Kiev, 1437. Ordained from Constantinople, he arrives together with his disciple Grigory. Grigory the Bulgarian, the Metropolite of Kiev, Haluch and all Rus in 1458 to 1473.
Вярно казав. Ти ще дня напролет сакаторики.
На призима та казать, чому аж доходиш?
Перехід, яка то побачиш, тата.
Туреччина не крає пристигнахти. Принеси говори за новим митрополит.
Той велик чоловік.
Ukraine, 15th century. Isidore announces the plans about the church union of Rome and Constantinople, and also about the new ecumenical council that is supposed to adopt it. The union is meant to convince the rulers of Europe to send military help to protect Constantinople from the Ottomans. But special hopes are the only help given from the Orthodox Christians. Kiev, 1437.
Так.
Ви всі розумієте, для чого ми тут зібралися. Нам потрібне об'єднання і примирення християн. Рану розколу треба зцілити. Для цього наш святійший патріарх і папа Римський скликають Вселенський собор. Київська митрополія повинна взяти участь.
Може, тоді королі і князі нарешті допоможуть вартувати Царіград?
Так. Ми всі сподіваємось на правителів Заходу. Але православні князі повинні першими прийти на допомогу братам у Христі.
Але ж тут у нас таке робиться. Наші князі весь час між собою гризуться. Он з митрополитом Герасимом що вчинили. А він лише миру прагнув. Мабуть, не варто співатися, що.
Ми знаємо. Але цьому треба покласти край. Нам потрібен мир між православними і згода між православними та латинянами. Справа миру, єдності християн та захисту Константинополю – велика спільна справа для всіх нас. Вселенський собор скаже своє слово.
Для нас це велика відповідальність. Для всіх нас це дуже велика відповідальність.
Ми всі сподіваємось на єдність та розуміння.
Добре. Тоді домовились.
Домовилися.
Kiev could only help Constantinople with prayers. That is why Isidore, who was going to lead the delegation of Kiev Metropoly to participate in the Council of Florence, first goes to Moscow.
Речет Господи, заступник мой еси и прибежище мое, Бог мой, и уповаю ему спасение мое.
Perhaps it is that moment when young Nestor joins the delegation, as Kiev-Pechesk Monastery Abbot Nikifor commanded.
Нестор, я не можу уявити, що на нас чекає. Об'їхати всю Русь, і на Москву завітати, і до Новгорода, а тоді через Варязьке море до німців, а потім на південь до Італії. Оце так подорож, слухай.
Страшенно хвилююся. Я взагалі ніколи з Києва не виїжджав.
Моліться за успіх нашої місії.
Я вже почав.
Півночі на колінах простояв.
Florence. This city is a real pearl of the Italian Renaissance, the place where the last ecumenical council has been held. Santa Maria del Fiore, the masterpiece of Arnolfo do Cambio, Giotto do Bombonde, and Filippo Brunelleschi. After a long trip to Italy, Isidore of Kiev and his delegation finally joined the council. It was the last time when such an event took place. The best scholars, the most influential clergy from the East and the West, gathered in Ferrara and then in Florence. For more than 1 year, they had been trying to find common ground for uniting the Christian world. But mutual understanding was not complete. The old friend of Isidore, Mark, the Bishop of Ephesus, refused to sign the final decree of the council. Perhaps he was afraid that if the Turks found out that the Greeks planned some joint actions with the Latins, then a real massacre would be staged. Mark the Bishop of Ephesus, Manual of Genic, 1392 to 1444.
Радий тебе бачити, старий друже.
І я тебе. Шкода, що імператор наказав тебе не випускати. Бо ти ж людей баламутиш.
Я гадав, що ми зробимо на цьому соборі щось достойне і величне. Але я не підпишу цю постанову, яку ви приготували. Вона суперечить нашим догматам.
Але, друже, постанова компромісна. Східна і західна церкви визнають святість традицій, вчення та таїнства одна одної.
Я не погоджуюсь з цим.
То ти хочеш, щоб Західна церква повністю відмовилася від свого вчення?
Так.
Як ти так можеш? Ти вважаєш їх єретиками, наших братів у Христі? Саме зараз, коли нам так потрібна їх допомога?
Вони нам не допоможуть. Їм не до нас. От кому є до нас діло, то це туркам.
То ти вважаєш, що твій Ефес?
Так. І мій Ефес, і всі інші міста і селища. Якщо турки дізнаються, що ми про щось домовилися з латинянами, і нам іде на допомогу військо Заходу, буде щось страшне. Турки виріжуть нас усіх. Їх помста буде дуже жорстокою.
Невже ти не розумієш? Не можна боротися з ворогом і при цьому намагатися не дуже його розізлити.
Який ти впертий, брате Ісидоре.
The attempts to unite forces against the Ottomans are largely unsuccessful. The young king of Poland, Vladislav, dies in 1444 in the Battle of Varna. This takes Poland away from the anti-Turk game. European rulers only verbally express their deep concern about Turkish conquests. Everybody is too busy pursuing their own agendas. The Greeks are left completely behind. Florence, July the 6th, 1439. The signing of the Florentine Union. Pope of Rome, Eugenius IV.
А що каже Марк? Добре. Підписуємо.
Avramenius, the Bishop of Suzdal, the participant of the council. Byzantine Emperor Ioan VIII, 1392-1448.
Можна було очікувати, що ми за один рік вирішимо всі питання, які виникли за 4 століття. Але ми нарешті почали говорити один з одним. Сподіваюсь, зараз ми зможемо мовити правителів Заходу, надати допомогу грекам.
Nevertheless, the agreement was reached and signed. The decree was signed by Isidore of Kiev and Avramius of Suzdal on behalf of Rus. But it is the time when numerous intrigues heavily corroded church affairs. On the west, a new anti-pope called Felix was elected in Bazal. In Muscovy, a new schism is conceived by Duke Vasily, later known as Vasily the Dark. He wants to build up a separate Moscow church under his full control. Under these circumstances, there is nobody to take care of saving Constantinople. Moscow, 1440. Simeon Hieromonk of Suzdal. Vasily the Dark, 1415 to 1462, the Duke of Muscovy, grandson of Dmitry of Don and Grand Duke of Lithuania, Batalas, backer of the self-proclaimed Moscow Church.
Він ніколи не погодиться.
Що ж будемо робити? Великий князю, Ісидор наш митрополит, патріархом рукоположений.
Знаю. Але нам потрібен свій митрополит, який буде сидіти тут, на Москві, і робити те, що треба нам, а не Константинополю чи Риму.
Але так не можна, Великий князе.
Це мені не можна. А вам? А вам можна. Зберіть єпископів і виберіть митрополита Московського.
Це не жарт. Але кого?
Та мені байдуже. Хоч і он одноушила.
Але ж нас ніхто не визнає. Це розкол церкви, князя!
Про визнання потім подбаємо. А зараз робіть те, що я вам наказую. Ти мало посидів в моїй темниці, Симеоне?
Достатньо, Великий князе.
Гадаєш, я забув про твої таємні зносини з Новгородом? От і добре. А тобі, Аврамі, ще треба за Флоренцією покаятися.
Ми скличемо наших єпископів. Великий князя.
Добре.
Правда, їх буде небагато. Іона Рязанський.
Так.
Валам Коломенський.
Хто ще?
Герасим Пермський.
Добре.
Ну і Саранський єпископ. Іов. Точно прийде. А хто ще?
Ми зберемо всіх вірних тобі, священників, Великий князе.
Ми скличемо свій собор і приймемо рішення, яке скажеш, Великий князя.
Великий князя Московський, Василій. Добре. І запам'ятайте, Великий князь Московський, Василій.
Soon after Isidore came to Moscow from Florence, Duke Vasily imprisons him in a cell of the Chudov monastery in the Kremlin. He demands that Isidore supports the schism in the Orthodox Church the Duke was about to initiate. Moscow, Kremlin, Chudov monastery, 1441.
Ісидоре. Ну як тобі моя темниця, Ісидоре?
Достойне місце, князе.
Не погодишся служити великому князю Московському? Ніколи з цього підвала не вийдеш.
Я служу Богові і церкві. А ти кому служиш, князе?
Ти впертий.
Я знаю, що ти замислив. Це тобі не проститься.
На Москві має бути свій митрополит. Ти не схочеш. Когось іншого знайдемо.
Це святотатство. Не можна привласнювати церкву, бо вона належить Богові, а не Москві. І не тобі, князе. Русь не прийме цього. Константинополь.
От для того ти, Ісидоре, мені і потрібен. Щоб прийняли і визнали. Ти маєш вплив, і мови знаєш. Не те, що наші священники.
Єресь унію засуджує, бо ти їм наказав. А самі навіть постанову Вселенського собору не можуть прочитати, бо латину і грецьку не знають.
Ну, як знаєш.
Isidore yields to no persuasion. 6 months later, he and his disciples managed to escape. Perhaps Vasily had agreed to that, simply not daring to put the metropolite to death. but the Duke does as he had planned. Soon a new metropolite is elected in Moscow, as Vasily had commanded. Another church schism is in full tilt, this time in Kiev metropolis. Isidore keeps on performing his metropolite's duties in the vast territory of Rus. In 1452, he and his disciples travelled to Rome to help the Holy See to gather a strong anti-Turk coalition of European powers to save Constantinople. However, this plan does not work. Vatican, our time. Apostolic Library, perhaps the most important library in the world. Isidore played his part in its founding and systemization. Rome, 1452.
Вітаю. Працюєш?
Працюю.
Працюю. Не буду заважати. На жаль, невтішні новини. Сканденберг і Януш Хуняді не прийдуть на допомогу Константинополю. Сил у них залишилось мало. Їм не пробитися.
А Арагонський флот?
Венеція втягла Арагон у свою сварку з Міланом. Вони всі тепер зайняті саме цим.
А Генуя?
Генуя боїться втратити торгові шляхи і не хоче сваритися з османами. Проте у італійців флот переважно торговий, а військових кораблів зовсім мало.
А православні правителі?
Ти наче сам не знаєш. І послухайте, годі вже питати. Всі зрадили Константинополю. Всі! Окрім Риму.
Але ж папська казна майже пуста.
Так, момент зараз дуже важкий. Кардинали, що засіли у Базелі, і досі інтригують. Грошей у папи майже немає. Але він обіцяв допомогти. Значить, допоможе.
Так, будемо сподіватися.
Ну добре, працюй. Не буду заважати.
The Pope gives all the money he has to employ some mercenaries. The squad of 200 bowmen, headed by Isidore, is sent to Constantinople. Rome, 1452.
Мені повідомляють, що албанці та угорці продовжують бойові дії проти османів.
В них майже не залишилося війська. Якщо не об'єднати, сили правителів Європи нас всіх переб'ють поодинці.
Так. Але, гадаю, зараз турки візьмуться саме за Константинополь.
Треба передати допомогу місту якомога скоріше.
Гроші, які зараз є, вистачить лише на 200 генуезьких лучників. Наймачних накриті. Саме повезеш їх в Константинополь, Ісидоре.
Patriarch is temporarily away from Constantinople, and Isidore becomes one of the leaders of the city defense. Apart from his archers, some other squads of volunteers, mainly from Italy and Spain, arrive in the city. No other help is sent, either from the west nor from the east. A great army of the young Sultan Mehmed blocks the city and gets ready for the assault. More than 100,000 Turks against 7,000 defenders. And of the latter, the professional warriors are only a half. The Ottomans cast huge cannons, bombards, hoping to destroy the city walls. Prince Orhan, Mehmed's uncle and the throne claimant, lives in Constantinople in exile. He and his men join the city defenders.
Selamünaleyküm.
Aleykümselam.
Prince Orhan, Mehmed's uncle and the throne claimant,
Hristiyan bir molla için çok çalışıyorsun.
40 az zamanım var.
Hepimizin az zamanı var. Yeğenim kimseye rahat vermez. Görüyorum ki çok dil biliyorsun.
Hiçbir zamanım fazla olmaz.
Nerelisin Bilge Molla?
Ben keyifli bir Rusum. Sıradan bir keşişim.
Ben de sıradan bir prensim. Osmanlı tahtının haklı varisiyim. Ben ve halkım bu kentin tutsaklarıyız. Konstantinopolis bizim evimiz ve biz onu koruruz. Ama unutmamalıyız ki en büyük savaş insanın kendi nefsine karşı verdiği savaştır.
Bu Abi Halid el-Gazali mi?
Evet, onun kitabından.
Ha.
Fakat biraz daha zamana ihtiyacın var. Daha sonra bütün eski kitapların bilgeliği sana aktarılacaktır. Şimdilik hoşça kal Molla. Daha sonra görüşmek üzere.
Most likely, Nestor has travelled together with Isidore and Grigori for years. That is how he ended up in Constantinople. About half a year passes after Isidore and his disciples have arrived in Constantinople and before the hostilities have actually started. Grigori is assigned to become the hegumen of St. Demetrius of the Sultan monastery. It is a very important position that had been held by Isidore himself before he was ordained to be the Kiev metropolite. Nestor must have had some time to spend in the Patriarch library and to learn some military arts. Not excluded, he got to know Prince Orhan and received military training in his squad. Constantinople, spring 1453.
Esselamu Aleyküm.
Aleykümselam.
Bak, sen ve kılıcın Bir bütün olacaksın. Hisset.
Ben sadece bir keşişim.
Silahı olan herkes bu şehri savunmalı. Bu arada İsador Molla'nızın gönderdiğinden çok daha fazla savaşçım var benim burada.
Gelininiz bir Sultan Mehmed.
Orada dünyanın en büyük ordusu varsa burada dünyanın en cesur ve ölümüne savaşacak savaşçıları var.
Anlıyorum. Allah senin iradesi olursa burada yok olmayacağız. Öyle mi?
The siege starts on May the 2nd, 1453. Almost 2 months of uninterrupted storms and shelling. The Turks try to get into the harbour. Their bombards and siege towers never bring them the intended success. The city is under naval blockade. The battles are on the sea, on the walls, and also below ground in the tunnels dug by the miners mobilized from Srebrenica. The attacks are repelled with a great number of casualties. Mehmed's army crumbles away, but the forces of the city defenders also get depleted. Mehmed grows aware that the siege cannot be carried out as it has been so far. He decides for one last general assault to be launched against the whole length of the city walls. The last storm starts at midnight and continues through the morning. The Emperor Constantine dies by the Golden Gate together with his brother Philippus. The Ottomans break into the city. Istanbul, our time. Here is the museum Panorama 1453, located at Topkapi, the artillery gate in Istanbul. Here we can see the impressive panorama of the assault, but it is also the general picture of the whole campaign. If there were so many warriors on the walls, the Ottomans would have found it difficult to have taken the city. The total length of the land walls was about 5.5 kilometers. There were no more than 7,000 men to defend these outer walls. There was only one defense line, Parateichion. There was nobody to defend the inner walls and the towers. May 29, 1453 was the Trinity Day. The scales of the world's history were shakily hanging. Mehmed had no more reinforcement. The last attack could well have been defeated just like all the others before. But in the very decisive moment the defenders needed just 100 or so soldiers to push the enemy away from the wall's breach. That was the price of the treason, disinterest and unconcern of the rulers of the West and East, who never bothered to help Constantinople. The city is on fire. The remaining troops of the city defenders managed to push their way to the harbour and board the ships. Many city dwellers also escaped together with the military. It was a huge drama of thousands of people. Some of them have left notes about these events. The tale on the taking of Constantinople by the Turks, written by Nestor-Iskander, is one of these important documents. The author survived, though he had been wounded. There are only some terse notes about this in his book. Suffered in the military campaign. Hiding here, hiding there. At the end of the book, there is a small note saying that the author had been Turkized, or forcefully converted into Islam when he was still a child. But certainly, his refined bookish language of Kyivan Rus is incompatible with that. It is also said that the author was serving in the Turkish army and had then entered the city. There he had found out some virtuous men about everything that had happened in the city. But his text and knowledge tell a different story. Nestor had been in the city during the siege and fought on the walls. It explains his wounds and escape.
Де я? Що зі мною?
Hayata kıldın. Ölümlü olan budur.
Була битва?
Sessiz ol, güçlü koru.
Де я? Де всі інші?
Yakında öğreneceksiniz. Şimdilik dinimiz gerekiyor.
А місто? Що з містом?
We know that Isidore and Gregory were taken prisoners. It is not clear how they managed to escape to Rome. Gregory comes back to Rus as a new metropolite of Kiev, known as Gregory the Bulgarian. But neither Isidore nor Gregory are mentioned in the book, although they played an important role in the city defense. Instead, the Patriarch is mentioned many times, but we know that he was absent. The original of his book is lost. We only have a copy written about 50 years after the events. This copy, kept in the Troitse Sergei monastery in Russia, has been heavily edited and contains many strange mistakes. Moscow scribes must have changed the original text. They substituted Isidore with non-existing Patriarch and omitted every note on Gregory, who had commanded the squad of the monks. Nestor-Iskander must have had mentioned this. We also understand why the book was edited this way. Isidore and Gregory were the church leaders who had fought against the self-proclaimed Moscow Church. Still, there are many open questions in this story. The most important one is why and how Nestor became Iskander. Iskander means Alexander, a hint to Alexander the Great. The Turks could have called Iskander only a man who had great military talents and distinguished himself in battles. It could well be they were the Turks of Prince Orhan who had given Nestor this second name.
Hayatta kalmışsın. Ayrıca başladığın işi bitirmelisin.
Yapabilir miyim? Bilmiyorum.
Evliya gibi adammışsın. Kur'an'da der ki Allah yolunda olanları sever ve onları korur. Sen de Allah yolunda olanlardanmışsın.
Burada olan her şeyi yazıp anlatmalıyım.
Bu çok iyi. Şimdi iyileş ve güçlen. Hoşça kal Moğol.
We don't know what happened to Orhan, but he must have had some friends and supporters in the Turkish camp. There are good reasons why Mehmed, after taking the city, persecuted some of his Bashis for treachery. They could have helped Isidore and Grigori to escape the city. Nestor converting to Islam and becoming Nestor-Iskander could have been part of that plan. But the details of this story would remain unknown. We can only guess whether Nestor-Iskander came back to Rus and about his future life. The main thing is that he survived and wrote his tale, and other people have seen his work. Even after editing, it is still an outstanding example of the literary work of Kyivan Rus. The defence of Constantinople in 1453 is both a tragic and heroic story that united Western and Eastern Christians, Muslims and Christians, and people of different nations and cultures. That was how a real united Europe began to manifest itself. A Europe which still has a long way to go. We should also give proper respect to every actor of this great historical drama, beginning from its leading characters, the brave last Emperor Constantine XI, who died in battle, and Sultan Mehmed, whose military and organisational genius was much ahead of its time. It is also one of the most glorious and life-changing pages in the history of the Turkish people for many centuries. But the main character of our story is Nestor-Iskander. Who was he? Was he Orthodox, Uniate, or Muslim? The man who had himself become the Bosphorus, uniting the worlds, East and West, medieval and Renaissance, Hagia Sophia in Istanbul and St. Sophia Cathedral in Kiev. We should remember this story of the brave monk warrior, the last outstanding writer of Kyivan Rus and our glorious compatriot.